This morning, if you will permit me, I thought I'd like to make a brief venture into some of those issues which are deeply and constantly on my mind. I received a very friendly letter yesterday from Maria Minna, who is the Canadian Minister of Development Cooperation. I don't usually hear from Liberal cabinet ministers, so my heart was palpitating and my knees were shaking and my hand was trembling as I opened the letter. And it was an invitation to participate in a conference in June of this year where Canada hopes to oversee its foreign policy and its international stance. And I thought as I was on my way here this morning that what I'd like to do, partly for myself, partly for you, is give a brief sense of preview of the issues that I would really like a country like Canada to reconnoiter, and that rest deeply in my heart for what it's worth. Number one, I remain absolutely stunned by the force and terror of this pandemic called HIV/AIDS. I'm off again next week to Zimbabwe to do some work in this field. But the last time I was in Zimbabwe, which was last October, I had the occasion to visit a little primary school called the David Livingstone Elementary School in Harare in the capital, and to attend a class of 10-year-olds, a grade 5 class, 40 or 45 of the liveliest, brightest, most engaged, adorable kids I've seen in a classroom in a long time. The teacher was engaged in what was called lifestyle education, a vehicle through which she could introduce questions around HIV/AIDS and deal with the subject matter. And she said to the children, I want you to write down your chief worry on a piece of paper, and then put it in this little box, and I'll draw out the individual pieces at the end of this session, and we can discuss them one by one and see what you've written and see what you feel. And she began drawing out the pieces of paper, and 7 or 8 of every 10 slips dealt with death. Death of a parent, death of a grandparent, death of an aunt, an uncle, a friend, the father of a friend. These are 10-year-olds. And when the teacher said to them, what is your answer to this? The kids overwhelmingly responded with the word prayer. And when the teacher said to them, explain to me more fully what you mean by prayer, they said, we turn to God. And as I left the classroom, I said fairly unselfconsciously to the teacher, but a little awkwardly, I don't understand the answers. And she said to me, you're right, you don't understand. When everyone is dying all around you, when your country feels like a graveyard, then all you know is prayer. We pray at lunch, we pray after school, we pray on Saturdays, we pray all the time. These kids have so little hope that they're driven to the feeling that only the intervention of God will somehow rescue their circumstances. And I can't convey to you in words, I don't have the force and the power to convey to you in words the way these societies are being shredded, the entire infrastructure. There are 25 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who carry the virus. There are 4 million new infections every year. There are 2.5 million deaths. There are 13 million orphans. I beg you to consider what it means. It means young children, almost always girls, ages 12, 13, 14, who are heading households of other children. We call them child-headed households. Frequently the households get together, so they have a whole group of siblings in their home whom these little girls parent. They have no food to speak of. They're largely impoverished. There's very little shelter. Some of them are driven to child labor. Some of them are driven into child prostitution. It is beyond human imagining that this situation continues and that it continues to deteriorate. And what is so brazenly ugly about it is that even though there's a great deal of fault in the negligence of the leadership in Africa itself, there is an astonishing moral lapse on the part of the Western world in our refusal to intervene with sufficient assistance. Can you imagine if 25 million people who could be kept alive in North America were simply allowed to die? Can you imagine the incomparable public outrage? Of course, it wouldn't happen at all. Would never be allowed to happen. But on the continent of Africa, and increasingly in South Asia, and increasingly in many of the Central Asian countries, and in a large part of the Caribbean, the toll that is taken is beyond human imagining. And now we have this fascinating phenomenon where the shift in the world's attention has moved from a concern about prevention and a concern about care to a concern about treatment, because the people living with AIDS are demanding treatment. And so we have a battle with the international pharmaceutical companies, where you have a number of companies in the world who are prepared to provide generic drugs at cost or even below cost to sell to Western governments, who can then provide the drugs free to African countries and to the people who need them. And the major drug industry is fighting it every step of the way, while pretending to negotiate through the United Nations, negotiations with which I'm intimately familiar, and pretending to welcome the presence of drugs which may have enormous life-saving or at least life-sustaining capacity. The people in North America who take antiretroviral drugs for treatment, these so-called drug cocktails, are kept alive for many years, some of them a full lifetime. The same could be true in sub-Saharan Africa. But just as the drug companies pretend to care about the cost, so they use the intellectual property rights agreements and the World Trade Organization as a vehicle to thwart the reduction in costs. Thus, as you will all read and hear about on Monday next, all of the pharmaceutical companies in South Africa have joined to take the South African government to court to prevent the government of South Africa providing a license for the manufacture of generic drugs, so that the 4 million people stricken with AIDS in their country can be treated, because no one can afford the present costs. Similarly, the United States has issued a challenge under the World Trade Agreement to the government of Brazil, because they want to add 2 more generic drugs to their treatment patterns. In Ghana recently, GlaxoSmithKline, one of the world's leading drug companies, threatened to take the government to court and a generic drug manufacturer in India to court, because there was an effort being made to provide low-cost drugs. There has to be a way, at the beginning of the 21st century, to introduce a kind of regimen of social decency between the developed world and the developing world. There's something profoundly wrong. It must be corrected to allow millions of people in the developing world to die when you have the drugs that can provide them with life. What in God's name is going on? And I've often thought, for what it's worth, that a country like Canada, which has a very considerable moral standing in the world, were it to take a strong public position, were it to use its money along with encouraging other Western governments to use their money to purchase low-cost drugs, to provide them beneath cost or free to the nations which are ravaged by this pandemic, to make the contribution that we would all make if it were humanly possible to make to keep lives going, that this is the kind of contribution for which a country like Canada is enormously well suited.